All right, welcome to the Introduction to JavaScript course at scrimba.com. We're going to be talking about a lot of things, a lot of important concepts in JavaScript, starting with data types and control flow, and basically everything that you're going to need to get up and running by the end of this course. It's going to be covered over 14 lessons with 7 different challenges. These challenges are going to be some concepts that you may know the answer to if you're paying attention in the course, or you may not. They are designed to introduce you to some of the stranger or weirder parts of JavaScript, a little bit about JavaScript. JavaScript was written in 10 days. It's an event-driven language and object-based language, and it was originally designed to make web pages more dynamic, and that's where it has grown and flourished. Although you can use JavaScript for databases, for the back end, for mobile applications, JavaScript's home is in the front end client side development with HTML and CSS. It's one of those core 3 things. HTML is sort of the body, CSS is how it looks, and JavaScript is making sure that it's dynamic. A little bit about me. I've been working in JavaScript for about 2.5-3 years. I'm currently a front-end engineer, although I do full stack. I'm also a content creator on YouTube, and if you click on the icon, you can go check out my channel. I do software tutorials and talk about topics related software, as well as has my own Udemy course. I'm really excited to be making this course. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So in any programming language, you're going to need a way to store language and values. And the way that we can do that in JavaScript are with 3 main keywords. Var, which is essentially deprecated, and I don't recommend we use, so we're not going to cover that because I don't even want that to be part of your mind. But if you see var, example equal to true, for instance, we now can console.log example like so, save it. It's going to log it out, right? So it's going to print it out. That's what console log does. But here we're storing a reference to the value true. And if we wanted to make this, Dylan, for instance, and we saved it, update it, you'll see it's going to print out Dylan. But don't worry about var. Instead of using var, what you want to use is let. And when we get to for loops, I'll go into a little bit more detail as to why var has been deprecated. But right now, when you're storing values that you're going to override, and the way that we override variables is we already have example defined here. We can go ahead and say example is now equal to, we'll do my last name, Israel, right? ISRAEL, save it. You see here, we're not getting Dylan. Although Dylan is originally set, it then gets overwritten by example here with our let. Now, if we wanted to make a constant, we would use const, but you see we get this syntax error. The reason for that is when you're dealing with a constant, when you're talking about strings, when you're talking about Booleans, when you're talking about numbers, and we'll dive into data types in the next video, but constants cannot be overwritten when dealing with primitive values. And we'll talk a little bit more about primitive values and data types. But typically, if you're going to override values like so, or if we wanted to override right here, get rid of that, us resetting the value, we would use a const, right? But if we're going to reset a value, potentially, we're going to use let. We're going to dive a little bit more into detail about how that is typically true unless we're dealing with arrays or objects. In the next video, we're going to talk about data types. But in terms of storing data, what you're going to be using is let and const. All right, let's start by talking about what a string is. You saw earlier we printed out my name, and we printed out my name using console log, and we have this variable here called name, and so it's going to go ahead and print out Dylan, right? We showcased that earlier. So what this is called, this data type here, is a string. We can actually use this type of word here, one word, to actually find out what it is we want to print it out, and you'll see that it's printing out string. So that's one way. If you ever get confused, you can kind of check that out. But there's not too many data types in JavaScript, which is nice. But you'll see here, we have double quotes around it. We can also do single quotes, but the quotes have to match, right? We can't have a double quote on one side and a single quote on the other. and that will work as well. So one other thing, let's actually go ahead and make this first name. Let's create another variable called last name, and we're going to set this to Israel. And notice how I'm ending these statements with semicolons as well. This is good convention. So what we'd want to do, say we wanted to concatenate this. Well, we could do something we could do something like this, where we do first name plus, and then we want a space, right? An empty character plus last name, and we save it, and then we're going to get this nice spaced out word here. And you'll notice we'll showcase it without the space. It's going to look all, they're going to be touching, right? And that doesn't look very good. And it used to be up until ES6, which is the 2015 edition of JavaScript. Every year, the ECMAScript Foundation, which runs JavaScript, adds new updates to the language, that we would have to do something like that. Now, in as of 2015, which is 3 years ago, it has browser support throughout the world, so you don't have to worry about it not working in any language. We can use what's called string interpolation. You'll notice these backtick icons, and if you're having an issue finding them on your keyboard, it's to the left of the one. And what this is going to allow us to do is essentially throw in our variables with this $ curly brace, opening curly brace, closing brace, and then we can put first name, and then we could just put a space, and then insert our variable here, last name, and we can then have it print out nice and clean. So when you're trying to concatenate or add strings together, you might want to consider using the curly braces. All right, now let's go and give some methods that you're going to be using with strings. So what is a method? A method is a function. What is a function? A function is a set of instructions. It's essentially how we are going to store our code, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that later on. But in our example here, JavaScript strings come with some methods that allow them to do certain things for us. And a good example of that is, let's say we wanted to have this print out. We have this long length here. We can call this property.length just to get an idea here. You'll see we have 24 spaces, which is a lot, right? So each one of these is a single space, and we've added a bunch, and we add some more on here. It's going to be up to 32. So that's one string property that is going to exist on every string. Another thing to keep in mind is that maybe we want to not have all this empty space on the end. What we can use is called the trim property. We'll go ahead and drop this down, and you'll see .trim, and this is going to remove all the empty space on the end of the string and at the start of the string. And so when we save it, it's going to trim it, and then you'll see that our 32 length, and we added more on, it's going to be just 12, right? Dylan, Israel, and then that +1 empty character. All right, let's showcase a few other methods about strings. Now, there's over 20 methods for pretty much any data type. And strings, I think, has even more than that. So we're just going to touch on a few of these. Let's start by cleaning this up, right? We already showcased what trim is. We can go ahead and clean this up, and we showcase length. We'll get the total amount of characters that are in there. So there's the 2 uppercase. So you want to change the whole word to be 2 uppercase. You'll see it's now there. And as you might have guessed, there's also 2 lowercase. Save that, you'll see everything's now lowercase, and there's also split. So what split's going to do is this is going to take in a parameter, which essentially means, hey, we want a value that's going to be used in this method. And by default, if we pass, so we're going to pass in a single parameter. You'll see here, I'm passing in an empty space, 1 empty space. And what that's going to do is it's going to take this string, and then it's going to break up the string based on all the empty spaces. And so you'll see we only have 1 empty space. So what we're going to get when we save this is an array, which is another data type we're going to dive into a little bit more, that is going to break our strings out into an array of strings, essentially going to find every value in which there is a gap in here. And if we wanted to do it on every character, all we would do is pass in an empty character, and then you'll see we'll get our entire string broken out and even our empty character in that. So those are just a few of the more popular, if you will, and widely used string methods. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about numbers next. All right, we're at our first challenge here for the strings, and what the objective here is, we have our first name and we have our last name. And what we want to do is we want to concatenate a value with called full name that is then going to be printed out. You'll see right now full name is not defined. So let's go ahead and pause the video real quick and see if you can fix this to work well with your first name and last name spaced out. All right, so hopefully you're able to do this. If not, don't sweat it. You're just getting started. So we're going to define a const variable here because we're not going to modify full name. And in reality, we could have done the same for first name and last name as well if we wanted to be sticklers about it. So there's two different ways we can go about it. We can do the first name plus the empty space plus last name, and this would work just fine as well. This would be considered bad convention now that we have our standards in ES6, as I mentioned earlier. So instead, hopefully what you did was you used the backticks, the $, you passed in first name, space, last name to get going here. And that should have worked for you just fine. And of course, a semicolon at the end. All right, so let's dive into numbers. So let's create a variable here called example, and we're going to set it equal to 7. All right, and then we just want to console.log our example value out. Well, 7. So this is a number. It's pretty much exactly how you'd expect it. Now, if you're more familiar with object-oriented languages, one of the things that may be a little bit different is other languages have multiple number types. JavaScript does not. JavaScript has one number type, and that is number. So if we created 7.77 repeating, that is still a number. And we can check it again just with the type of keyword, and you'll see it's going to print out number. All right, let's go give an example of parse int. So right now this is a floating point number, right? There's decimal places. But let's say that we only wanted to get the integer value. We'd use the parse int function and just wrap it like so. And now we're just going to get the whole number 7, which is nice, right? So sometimes we may not want to. You'll notice it doesn't do any rounding or anything like that. All it's getting is the integer here. Now, sometimes you may want to get the floating point number, which we can do with parse float just as easily, right? Because we may not want to drop that value. We want the whole value. So that's one way we can get it. You'll also notice that we can get this out of a stringified number like so and save that. And you'll see we'll actually get the number value from it. So we can parse and float from a string as well as parse that int from a stringified number as well. Now let's say that we wanted to return a certain amount of decimal places for our number that we have here. What we could do is, let's go ahead and get rid of this parse int. We can use the toFix, which will return it. And this is not only, .toFix. Let's say we want to do it 5 decimal places like so. You'll actually see it's going to add zeros on there. So it's going to go 7.77 and add these 3 zeros because that doesn't exist. But maybe we just want it to the 1 place, right? And you'll see it's actually going to round it up to 7.8. So that's one way that we can, add additional decimal places or set a certain amount of additional decimals when we're working with numbers. All right, welcome to challenge number 2. You'll see we have, or the numbers challenge rather, you see we have 4 values set up here. One using parse int with a string with some numbers in it, one using parse float with a string with some numbers in it, and then we have a number with toFix. If you thought that perhaps we could only call these methods on variables, that's not true. We can actually just put in the value directly like so. And then we have toFix on 200 with 2. So let's see if you guys can guess what these values are actually going to output. All right, so at first you may have thought that this parse int was kind of weird, and you're right. So when we actually go ahead and put out example 1, we'll comment these out. like so, and save it, you're going to see that it's going to get null. Okay, that makes sense. This isn't really a string. But what do you think is going to happen when we do the same thing for parse float here? Well, you may be surprised with the results. And this is one of those things I was mentioning earlier where people are going to say, well, that's kind of wonky. You'll notice it actually pulls the 44. So whenever you parse an int or parse a float, and we'll go ahead and delete this hello from this, you'll notice it will actually pull it out. So if your string starts with a number, it will find it and then pull it out. This is probably not something you ever want to do, bad convention, but it's something worth noting. And then we have our number here, and then with toFix, what do you think it's going to be? It should be 55, right? So we're going to pass in example 3, save it like so, 55. Very nice. And then finally, we're going to call toFix on example 4 and continue on. Great. You may be wondering why these are different colors. What do you think the types of all these are? Let's go ahead and continue with part 2 of this challenge. So try and figure out what each one of these console log types are. All right, hopefully you had a moment to think about it. So this first one is going to be a number because we're actually pulling out a number from it. Same thing with this second one, even though we're pulling it out of a string number. Now this toFix, the toFix number property, what do you think that's going to be? It's going to be a string. It actually converts it to a string when it rounds it up or drops or adds those values on. Same thing here. So just a little wonkiness in JavaScript worth mentioning. So up next, we're going to be talking about Boolean values. So let's create a variable here called example1, and we're going to set it equal to true. This is a true value. There is also a false value. And as crazy as it sounds, that's pretty much it for Booleans, really. Booleans are a true or false value. You can kind of think of it as a quarter. There's a heads and there's a tails, except Booleans are true or false. It either has to be one or the other. Where things get a little tricky with Booleans are when we start dealing with truthy values and falsy values. Now, one thing I did want to mention is that we have this Boolean function here that's going to evaluate if something is a true or false value. So you'll see here, if we save it, it's going to print out false, right? Because it is a false Boolean, and it's going to print out true because it is a true Boolean. Now, if we pass in a number, what do you think it's going to print out? Well, it's going to print out a true because this is a value that is a truthy value. And in our challenge, we're going to be talking a little bit about that. All right, we have 8 examples here of truthy and falsy values. And what I want you to do is just sort of make a mental note or maybe comment below a line of code or on a piece of paper what you think these outputs are going to be. Which ones are going to be truthy? Which ones are going to be falsy? Let's start with the example 1 here. We already showcased this earlier, that false, the Boolean value of false is a falsy value. And likewise with example 2, the true value here is a true value as well. Okay, what is null? This is going to be my only introduction to null in this course. It's not something I think we really need to cover too much in detail, but null is really a value that we are referencing that essentially says a developer plans on setting this value later on, and we're giving null as a placeholder, as an empty falsy value, as you might see here as well. And then there's undefined, which typically means that this is also a falsy value, but that usually means that either this variable wasn't defined. A lot of times you'll see that, okay, if we can actually assign undefined this way as well, which will also be a falsy value. But undefined usually just means that there's a variable or a property that doesn't exist that you're trying to reference. It's usually a bug in your code when you see undefined. So this string, this empty character here, what do you think that's going to be? You might be surprised to find out that's also a falsy value. However, what do you think if we put a space there? Well, that's going to be, it's going to be a truthy value. So empty strings like that are falsy values. And then we have this other value here, NaN. What is that? It stands for not a number. You're going to get not a number when you try to parse a string or something like that, where it's not going to return a value properly, or you're going to check there's some not a number methods that we can check out to say, hey, is this not a number? But this is essentially a value type just to tell you that's not a number, and that's a falsy value as well. And then we have -5. And so you're saying -5. I wonder, are negative numbers falsy or truthy values? Well, negative numbers are truthy values, as well as positive numbers. The only falsy value when it comes to numbers is 0. So be careful when you're getting started with that. So that's some of the little bit more wonkiness when it comes to truthy or falsy values in JavaScript. So next up is arrays. Whenever you're trying to deal with multiple values, you're probably going to deal with an array. So how do you instantiate an array? How do you set that? Well, you just use these square brackets. This is essentially our container. And then we can have multiple things in here like so, and then we can have access to them later on. But essentially, it's a list of items that you're going to be using in your code. Now, remember earlier when we were checking the length of a string, we can do the same thing with our example 1. So with our array rather. So let's go ahead and print this out, and we can call .length on it. And this is going to give us the length of array. Now, one thing to keep in mind with working with arrays, so you'll see 0, 1, 1, 2, 3. The length of this is 3. But say we wanted to, let's go ahead and change this to a 7. Say we wanted to get this first value. Arrays start on the 0 index. And so you're going to see 0, that's 5, and then 1, that's 7, and then 2, that's going to be 6. What do you think 3 is going to return? Well, it's going to return null because it doesn't exist. Null or undefined. Something to keep in mind when working with arrays is that they do start on 0, and the length is always going to be 1 greater than the last index value. Now, we're going to be talking about a few of the more common methods when it comes to arrays, but one thing to keep in mind is there's about 20 or 25 methods with arrays that you're going to need to know inside and out, and we're only going to touch on about 3 or 4 just to give you an idea of a few of them. But you're going to probably need to review all of these, and perhaps in a separate course we can deep dive into every single function. I have a Udemy course that does exactly that. But say we want to add a value here to example 1, we can use the push method, and let's go ahead and push the number 8 on there, and we'll change this to console log what we want to put out. And you'll see now we're going to add that last value. We can use push to add multiple values. So we'll do 8, 9, 10, save that. Bam. So it's going to add all of them. But let's say we want to remove the last value. We can use the pop method here. That's going to remove the last value. Now, one thing that's so that's one way to add add and remove the last values. Now, there's ways of adding the beginning values and adding a certain index value. We're not going to worry about that too much. One more thing I wanted to show you is how to override values. So remember earlier we were like, oh, well, we can target values to print out. But let's say we want to reset the value on that index 0. We can do it, and we'll just put 1 in there. And you'll notice that we're going to overwrite what comes up on that value. And say we want to iterate through the entire array, like so. We can do that with a for each statement. And then the element is going to be the current index value we're iterating on. So in our case, it's going to be 1, then 7, then 6, then 8. And we just, instead, all we want to do is console.log the element out here. Go ahead and save it. And what we're going to get is essentially 1, 7, 6, 8, 9, and then the final array, because it's going to iterate through each element in our array. All right, in our array challenge, you'll see we have a value here, an array of values, and you'll notice that there's different data types in here. We have a string, we have a number, and we have a truthy value. This is something that you can do in JavaScript as well. So we have a new value here, example 2, new variable, and we are setting it equal to example 1, and then we are pushing 11 to example 2. Now, my question for this challenge is, what do you think the value of example 1 is going to be, and what do you think the value of example 2 is? Now, it may surprise you to find out that the values are going to be identical. You're going to see that, if I spell console.log right, you're going to see that we have example 1 with the 11 as well as example 2. Why is that? Why is that even though we only pushed 11 onto example 2, that's still getting pass to example one. The reason for that is that when you're dealing with arrays and objects, you're passing by reference. What that basically means is example two is setting a reference or referring to example one. It's not actually creating a new array. So when you push to example two, you're actually pushing to example one. And how can we create a new array but still have these values in it? Well, a couple different ways. We can use the spread operator, which is going to ... going to unwrap these values in a new array, like so. And so this is gonna, these three dots is some ES6 is going to take all these values and essentially push them to this new array. And you'll see that's going to create a brand new array, so it's not passing by reference anymore. Another way that you can do this is using the map functionality, which is an array method that creates a brand new array, like so. And this is going to be an element. Remember, the element really just refers to the current index value we're iterating over, and we can return that element. This is going to create a new array. This is going to be identical to the spread operator, so I'd probably recommend doing the spread operator because it's less code. So just keep that in mind, is that when you're dealing with objects and arrays, you are passing by references, and sometimes you may not want to do that, probably most of the time, and that you're going to actually want to create a new array so that you can change the values without affecting the original array. So objects, much like arrays, are probably the two most important items that you need to be intimately familiar with. Objects are defined by these curly braces, like so. And they can take in what are called properties. So remember how we had our first name? We can do it like this, and we'll put in Dylan, and then we can have another property, and that can be last name, and that will be Israel. You'll see when we print it out, it's going to print out this entire object. But we don't, most of the time when we're displaying it for the user, we don't want the entire object. We just want the first name. So we can use the dot property, and then we can get the value that we want. And this will actually give us the first name property. So example one dot first name. And we can chain these downward as well. And let's say we do something like address, and we want to do city, and we'll do Austin. And then we'll do state, Texas. So we have this object here, and and these are strings, right? So they need to be wrapped in quotes to denote that they're a string. And we could continue downward. So we have address, and then we do .city, and then we'll get Austin. Now, when dealing with objects, you can not just use strings. You can also do like age, for instance, on here. I'm 30. You can do arrays. So how many cats do I have? I happen to have 3. One name is Milo, and then another is Tito, and then another is Achilles, and I apologize, I don't know how to spell my cat's name. But you can use multiple data types within objects as well. And you can also reset the values in our object. So let's say we want to set, it's my birthday. We wanted to reset age, for instance. I'm now 31. We could do that, and then we would target it if we wanted to print it out to confirm. You'll see we now get 31. All right, so some of the methods you want to know about objects are object.keys. So I don't know if I made this clear earlier or not, but this property name will also be referred to as a key, and then its value here will be the value. So say we wanted to get all the keys from our object, we do that with the object type dot keys, and then just wrap this like so. And you'll see when we print it out, it's going to print out all our keys. Notice how it doesn't print out the nested keys as well. It's only going to do it on the level that you're doing it. But let's say we want all the values. We could do that as well, and we'd get the value. So Dylan Israel, we're going to get the object here, which is city and state, 31, and then our array of values. Sometimes you may want to check if a property or a key exists on our object. One way that you can do that is to say example one dot has own property, And then in there, we're going to pass in a string value, and this is going to be the key that we're checking for, and that's going to be first name. You'll notice it's true. If we put first name 2, it's going to return false because that key does not exist in our object. Now, if you remember earlier when I said that arrays pass by reference, so do objects. So what do you think when we create this example 1 and then we set example 2 equal to example 1? And you'll notice that we're actually assigning a value to a property that doesn't exist. What do you think is going to happen in our object here? Well, your first guess might have been that this isn't even going to work, but that would be mistaken. Example 2 here is definitely going to add the last name property on there. Now, where there might be an issue is, say we want to do last name and then we do mother's last name or something like that. That wouldn't work. And the reason for that is that last name is not defined as an object, but example 2 is, which is why we can assign the last name property directly to it, and it works just fine. But you might have already guessed, as I told you earlier, this will pass by reference as well. And so when we're setting example 2 to example 1, we're going to go ahead and have these values that are going to get added to example 1 as well. So keep that in mind when you're creating objects. So you're going to need to instantiate a new object, and you're going to need to pass in the values directly instead of actually having to go and set, and it's going to pass by reference, so it may overwrite your original object. Now, how might we create that object, that class? Typically the easiest way is using the object method. And when you're working in classes, we're not going to dive into classes in this introduction course, but you might have a class that you would create a new instance of. But how do you do it with objects? Well, the object prototype has this assign property or method, method. Oh, there we go. Sorry, had a little bit of a issue here. And it's going to take in two properties. First, what you want to assign it to, which in our case is an empty object. And second, what it is that we're going to assign it to. So you'll see here, when we call object assign, it is going to create a brand new object, which is then going to go ahead and put the example 1 values into example 2. And thus, when we assign a new property to example 2, it's not going to pass by reference to example 1 because here we're instantiating a new object. So let's jump back to working with numbers again. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the arithmetic operators that are available in JavaScript. So right here we have our example 5. We can add, as you might imagine, and then we'll get 10. We can subtract, like 4, and then we'll get 6. We can, of course, times by 4, which would be 16 minus 10, so we're going to get -6, like so. And you'll notice we don't have to group these together. JavaScript is intelligent enough to know the order of operations of math by default. And then we can, of course, divide this by 4. So this is going to be 16 divided by 4 would be 4. 10 minus 4 is going to return 6. So we have all the standard math functionality when we're dealing with our arithmetic operators. All right, so hopefully those math operators here were a little bit of introduction or repetitive, and you're like, oh man, I know how to plus and minus. Excellent. So let's hit you with something that you may not be familiar with. And that's the modulo operator or modulus operator. So you see this % sign? This is going to return 0. Why is that? Well, modulo returns remainders of numbers. So when we modulo 5 by 5, it divides evenly and there's no remainder. What do you think happens when we modulo by 6? Well, it's going to return the whole number because it doesn't ever evenly divide. But if we modulo by 4, it's going to return 1. Modulo by 3, going to return 2. Modulo by 2, it's going to return 1, right? Because it goes to 4, and then there's a 1 remainder. So that's the modulo operator. Let's talk a little bit about relational operators. We have our two numbers here, 10 and 15. And so this is sort of related to the math operators. We didn't really dive into it, but relational operators will compare two items and then return a Boolean value, a true or false value. So when we take example 1, which is 10, and we say greater than or equal to example 2, what you're going to expect it to return is false, right? Because 10 is not greater than or equal to. However, if this was 15, it equals it, so it is greater than or equal to. You, of course, have less than or equal to as well, which will evaluate to true, as 10 is indeed less than or equal to 15. Now, the other relational operators are these values equal? Are these double equals? Is 15 equal to 10? That's false, right? It's not. But if we change example 2 to 10, that's true. And if we use triple equals, that's true as well. And we're going to talk in the challenge about what the difference between the double equals and the triple equals is, and why that's really important. So here you'll see that we are comparing the values. So let's say we want to see if they're not equal. How can we do that? Well, we can use this exclamation point and equal sign to be false, right? Because 10 is equal to 10, thus that's false. Now, is 10 not equal to 12? That is true, so it's going to return true. And then vice versa with this extra equals here to return true as well. Before we move on to the challenge, I want to actually talk about this double equals and triple equals and what that basically means. Remember earlier when we were console logging out the data type? So in our example here, we're going to log out the type of example 1 and the type of example 2, which is going to return number and number right now. So JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. What that means is in JavaScript, we have no problem taking this variable here, which has a type of number, and going ahead and setting it to a Boolean, for instance. That's something that we can do in JavaScript all day. It's not a big deal. Now, most languages are statically typed. So what that means is that if I wanted to have a number here, I'd probably have to create and assign it to a Boolean. I would have to have some additional logic or a new variable or something like that. But we have console, so each one of these are numbers. And when we want to do the comparison, there is a strictly equals comparison that compares the value and type. And then there is a sort of less strict comparison that compares only the value. So that's the real difference here. When we do this double equals, all we're checking is that the values are the same. So example 1 is equal to example 2. It's going to return false, right? But let's say we change this to the number 10. The value 10 is equal to the value 10 is double equals. That's a true statement. However, if we change this to a string in the loosely equals here, it's still going to be true, even though that this is a number 10 and a string 10, because all it cares about is the value. However, if we use the strictly equals and we take example 1 is triple equals to example 2, what it's going to check is not only that 10 is equal to 10, but also what is the data type? Is number equal to string? In that case, it's not, which is why it's going to return false. And the double equals on the not, remember the bang, this and this, it's the same there as well. It's checking the type and the value. All right, let's get a little practice in with the triple equals and the not equals. So in our 4 examples here, let's think a little bit about what is it that we're checking. And we're checking, are these values equal? Are these values equal? Are these values not equal? And are these values not equal? Let's think about it for a second and then dive into it. All right, so in our first example, let's go ahead and console.log out example 1. So remember with the strictly equals, this is checking type and value. They both are numbers and they both have the value of 5. So we're going to expect that to be true. Now, example 2 is 5 equal to string 5. Now, the loosely equals is just checking the type. So is the value 5 equal to the other value 5? And that is indeed true, and thus we're going to expect that to be true. And let's go move on to the not as well. So in example 3 here is the value 6 not equals to the value 6. And that's going to return what, do you think? it's going to return false because it is actually a true statement. 6 number is equal to 6 string because we're doing a loosely comparison. And vice versa, when we do console.log, example 4, that's going to return true because the console.log is not a thing. So console.log true because the string value 7 is not equal to the number value 7, and thus that returns true. All right, so sometimes we may just want to increment a number by 1. A lot of times when we're dealing with for loops or we're dealing with iteration, as well as subtract by 1. So how might we do that? Well, at first glance, you may do something like this, where you set example 1 is equal to example 1 plus 1, right? And then you'd see, oh, of course, it'd go up by 2. But this is such a common thing that JavaScript has built in a very easy way to increase by 1 by throwing this plus plus on our variable. And you'll see now we still get the same result. And if we were to call it again, we're going to get 3 because we've now added 1 and then we've added another one to get 3. It also has a easy way to subtract. And we can do that with minus minus. And so our 1 minus 1 will become 0. But let's say that we don't want to add or subtract by 1. How might we do that? Well, pretty straightforward. So we take example 1, and we're going to use this plus equals, and then we're going to say 5. And this is going to add 5 to it, to 6. This is exactly the same thing, again, as us doing example 1 is equal to example 1 plus 5. Similar to how we did plus plus, except now it's plus equals. Now, this isn't only relevant to adding or subtracting. Subtraction would work as well. You'll see we'll get 4. But also, we can multiply. 1 times 5 is 5. We can divide, so we'll get 0.2. We can even do our modulus operator that we showcased earlier, where modulo, when you modulo by a number greater than the number, it's going to return the whole number. But if we did something like 10, for instance, it's going to return 0. If we did 13, it'd have a remainder of 3. So that's a couple of ways that we can increment and decrement in JavaScript. All right, in our increment and decrement challenge, we're going to hit you with something you really haven't been exposed to, one of the stranger parts. So you'll see here we have example 1 and example 2, both equal to 5. And then you're seeing here we're adding 1 to example 5. I think we didn't talk about plus plus on the front of a variable. What do you think the difference between these two might be? There is a difference. It's subtle, but there is a difference. What do you think it might be? All right, so let's go ahead and uncomment these lines of code here and see what the values are. And you're going to see a 6 and 6. And you're saying, Dylan, is this the, two ways to do the same thing? And at first glance, it may appear that way, but in reality, not. So let's, instead of console logging the value out here, put our example plus plus as the value in our console logs and see what happens. This is going to be plus plus example 2. So what are you expecting these values to be? You're saying, well, they're probably going to be 6 and 6. You'd be wrong. So you see it's 5 and 6. The reason for that is when we do the plus plus on the end, it's going to add this value after this line of code. And if you do it on the beginning, it's essentially going to do it within the line of code. Now, it depends. There's very few instances where I've ever found a need to have to do the plus plus on the beginning. Typically, you'll see most lines of code will just have this as its own line of code. But if you wanted to add the iteration on the exact line of code, you'd have to throw it on the beginning of your variable. So that's one difference that you may never know, and this will be the same with minus minus as well. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about control flow using if, else if, and else, and what they are. So sometimes you only want your code to run for certain reasons. So in our if statement, like so, we can pass in example, which is 5. We're saying if this is equal to 5, meaning does this evaluate to true? Go ahead and console.log. Where do we want to put this? We'll put true statement. Or we'll just put runs. So you'll see when we run this, it's run because it is equal to this. However, if we were to say that this is equal to 6, this wouldn't run, right? We get no printout. And so our code nested within our curly braces here never actually runs in our if statement. So this if statement essentially is a gatekeeper that evaluates this logic here to tell us if something is true or not. Now, what is else if? Else if is a statement that runs only if this statement here, if this if statement failed. So you have to have an if for there to be an else if. So this else if is directly connected to this if statement. So if this fails, we're going to run another if statement here that's going to say, in our case, we'll just put true. That's going to run. And in it, we'll just put console.log else if. And you'll see now this is going to print out else if because this failed. And then it checks, is this true? It is, and thus it prints. So if we change this back to 5 and evaluate it, you'll see it's now printing out runs, but it's not printing out the else if because this already evaluated as true. And thus it never runs our else if because, again, it only runs if the if fails. So what is else? Else is the default value. So if the if fails, if the else if fails, and there's no true values between them, we're going to go ahead and print the console.log, or we're going to go ahead and run our code in our else statement, which in our case, we're just going to print out else. You'll see runs. Okay, so if we change it to 6, that's going to fail. So this fails, and that runs. Okay, cool. It's else if. Oh, it is true. So print else if. But what if this was false? It's going to finally get all the way down to this else because this fails, then this fails, and then we finally hit our else. All right, one other thing worth mentioning that we haven't talked about is and or. So far we've only been evaluating statements, one statement at a time. What if we wanted to evaluate 2 statements to make sure both of them were true? Not only is example, in our case, equal to 5, and we'll just say true is equal to true. So what this and statement, this double ampersand here is saying is, hey, when we run our code, check that not only is this true, but and this is true as well, which is why this runs. And vice versa, if we change this so that example is equal to 6, which it's not, it's going to fail, and this is false, so it's going to hit our else statement, even though this is true. But let's say we wanted to have it where if either one of these conditions are true, run our code, we would use an or statement like so, which is these 2 pipes. And then we run our code. So is example equal to 6? No, that's false. But true is in fact equal to true, and thus this runs. Now, if false was equal to true, it's going to fail, right? Because this is false, or this statement here is false, and this statement here is false. So that's and or. It allows us to concatenate essentially our conditions and check multiple conditions. Again, or is saying, hey, if either one, and then and would be, if both are true. And we can do this as many times as we need in our code. All right, let's see if you can guess the true or false values using our and or operators. We have 3 of them. Take a second, take a look, and then we'll go piece by piece. All right, hopefully you took a second to take a look. Let's take a look at this first one. We have a triple equals comparison on 10 being equal to 10 and 5 is less than 4. So we're going to evaluate these 2 statements. This is true and this is false. Thus, it should return false. And hopefully that was what you got here. False. Very nice. Let's look at a very similar statement with the only change in the logic here being an or statement. Well, on the left-hand side, we have a true statement. On the right-hand side, we have a false statement. But because we're using an or operator, because one of them is true, this is going to return true. Very nice. So last but not least, a little bit more of a complex one. I said earlier that you can increase the complexity of this very quickly. But you'll see here that we are essentially wrapping this statement here and then doing an and to compare this side. So it may look like there's 3 comparisons, but really, or more than 2 comparisons, but there's just this or and there's this and. So In here, we're saying, is 5 less than or equal to 5? Or excuse me, greater than or equal to 5? That's a true statement. Or is 4 greater than 4? That's a false statement. But because one of these is true, which is this statement, this whole block here evaluates the true, and then we evaluate this side. Is 3 plus 2 equal to 5? It is, and thus we return true as well. So you can see how this can get a little bit crazy relatively quickly, but I think it's some good practice. And if you're interested in practicing this, you just want to get it down, just Google control flow practice on practice JavaScript online. You'll come across a bunch of 20, 30 questions of things like this at a time that you can practice with. So let's talk about switch statements really quickly. Switch statements are going to feel very similar to an if, else if, or else statement because it is, again, some control flow on your code. But the difference with the switch statement is, say we're checking a finite amount of answers, and you want to know, you only want to run some code for 3 or 4 answers, and then you have a default value. A switch statement is really a different way of writing an if, else if, or else statement. Let's go ahead and give an example. Say we are taking a test, and we answer A for our test, so our student answer. In our switch statement, we're going to have this value here, and we're going to pass in student answer. And what that is say, hey, check our answer for each one of these cases, and then run some code. So in a case follows by a value. So we have, case A, and then in right below it, we'll have something that says something like, we'll console.log wrong. And then we have to break out of the switch statement. This break is very important because if you don't break out of it, basically this code is going to run if our student answer here is A. But if we don't break out of it, when we have another case like B, it's going to continue checking your code to make sure that it's right. And we'll just put console.log B is wrong. And then we'll, just for sake, A is wrong. And then we'll say C is the answer. And then again, for our case here, we need to break out of the logic. Otherwise, we're going to have some issues with it checking multiple answers when really the switch statement is designed to it should only go for the correct answer. And C, then we're going to put, we'll just console.log C is correct, period. And then we want to break out of here. So let's actually run our code like so and save it, and you'll see we'll get A is wrong. So our answer A here is wrong. If we change this to B, we're going to get B is wrong. And if we change it to C, we're going to get C is correct. Very nice. So what happens if we put this to D? Nothing runs. None of these is correct, but maybe we want a default answer. So if a value comes in, well, there's this default keyword here, which is essentially our else, where if all the other answers fail, go ahead and console D is wrong as well, because there's only 4 answers, or but not a real answer. And you'll see we get not a real answer here because it isn't A, it isn't B, it isn't C, and then we get not a real answer because this is a default value. You'll notice how I don't break from here. The break here is so that no additional things are ran. You don't really need a break on default. I couldn't tell you if it's clean convention or not, but there's no reason to do it unless code is better typically. But that's a switch statement. You pass in a value, you then check a case to see if it matches any, and then you also have the default here. Just make sure you break, otherwise you might run into a lot of errors down the road where it has multiple correct answers, or your logic's not going to work properly. Now let's say that we wanted to iterate through up to the numbers 0 to 5 to add those values to total. How might we do that? Well, a for loop would be an excellent way of doing that. And we create one by first instantiating a variable, essentially a counter variable, usually initialized by I for iteration. We're going to start it off at 0. And then this statement here, I is less than 5, this essentially will continue to run our for loop until this statement no longer is true. And then we're going to increase, remember, the I++ by 1 every iteration. And so if we were to console.log out I right now, what we're going to see are the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I is not less than, or I when it's 5 is not less than 5. Thus, it breaks the for loop, doesn't run the logic inside here, and then exits out. So how might we now modify our code to add the values of I to total? Well, we can do that by just doing total plus equals to I. Now let's go ahead and console.log out the values of total, which we know are those index values. So when we console.log out total, you'll see that it is now added all of our values to equal 10. So 0 plus 1 is 1, plus 2 is 3, plus 3 is 6, plus 4 is 10. And we get our value there. Now this is a for loop where we're going to actually know how many iterations it's going to be, 5. But how might we iterate through an array when we don't know how many values to iterate through? So let's create an array here, and we'll just call this a num array. And this is going to be equal to, I don't know, we'll just throw in some numbers of 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80. So we could, in theory, say, go ahead and put less than 8, but that's not good practice. That's not what you want to do with arrays, because maybe we add a value to this later on. So how might we make this a bit more dynamic? Well, we can set our right side here to num array dot length. Remember that dot length property, which is going to have this run for as many iterations that are in our array for the length of the array. But instead of actually adding the total value of just being the index value, we want the values out of the num array. How might we do that? Well, remember the index values are accessed with numbers, right? So if we want to just add index 0, we put that in there, or index 1 or index 2, but we want it to be on for every value. So every iteration, our I gets updated, and thus you'll see when we console.log out that value here right above total, num array I, it's going to hit the 0 and then 1, then 10, and you'll see that we get all our values in the console. So we're already adding all those values, and now we've been able to access them with our I variable here. And so at the end, we get a very large 360 number because we've added all the values in our num array, and vice versa. If we added 90 on here, you'll see that it will run and we don't have to refactor any of our code. So let's say we want to repeat our code, but we don't know, there's not a finite amount of answers, so we can't use a switch case. We don't know what the length of the array is going to be, or we don't know how many iterations to run. We just want it to run until a value is true. So a while loop might be what you're looking to do here. While loops are another way to run iterations of our code. And so what a while loop does is it runs until some sort of value here is false. In our case, let's go ahead and say count is greater than 20. This could be anything in here. And in our while loop, we're going to go ahead and add, we're going to say, we're going to do some logic, and then maybe at the end we'll say count plus plus. Now, the reason that this may seem very similar, and in its current setup, it is, and then at the end we'll go ahead and console.log count if we want to. And so this never runs, as you notice here, because count is never greater than 20, because this is a false statement. But let's go ahead and change this to less than. It's going to run 20 times. And you could do this in a for loop. That's true. But you can do some things with this where let's forget about numbers for a second. Maybe we want to have a local value where we're just, we're going to run this while it's true. And in here, we're going to put true. But we need to make sure now that we've hard-coded a true value in here that we are going to break out of this. So what we can do is if, what do we want to do? If count is less than 20, go ahead and greater than or equal to 20, what we want to do is we're going to start off first off by adding, and then you'd have other additional logic. And then you would say something like break. So this will break us out of our for loop. So when it's 20, we're going to exit out of our for loop here as well. So while loops are a way to run your logic, run your code for a set amount of time when you don't know how many times that's going to be. Now there's also do while loops, which are a little bit different than while loops. The main difference between a while loop and a do while loop is a do while loop will run at least once. Remember when we set this to false earlier, and this is a false statement, count never got touched. It never ran this code, not even once, to update count. But if we had a do while loop, it would do it. So let's go ahead and convert this while loop to a do while loop. It's pretty straightforward. So we're going to have a do with these clothing braces, these two curly braces, and basically all our logic here is going to be in our do while loop. And we're going to remove the curly braces on the while loop and just have while after the fact like so. Now, you'll see when we save our code here, count is actually going to be equal to 1, even though our while loop is false. So it's going to run this one iteration. Count is still not greater than or equal to 20, so we don't break out of the do while loop, but the actual while statement itself is false. We only run it the one time because it's a do while loop. So just something to keep in mind. It's very rare that I use a while loop or do while loop, but it is worth mentioning for those times where you don't have any way of knowing how many iterations, and you're basically checking a value until you get a right value to break you out of it. And that could be anything from, well, count is, equal to, Dylan or something like that, where you can't check the length, right? So you can check properties. The main thing to keep in mind is that you are going to be, it's usually not used with numbers, but it's for a set amount of iterations that you don't know. You just need to keep doing it until you get the result you're looking for. But it is also a word of caution, a good way to create an infinite loop, which will crash your program and maybe stop it altogether. All right, last but not least, functions. So we need to define a function. What is a function? A function is a way of storing our code so that we can call it again and again and reuse it. Part of being a software developer, part of being any developer, is writing reusable code. And it's a part of development that you're going to have to get comfortable with. So let's go ahead and define a function. We'll write a simple function called add. In JavaScript, you just note it by the keyword, the name of the function, and then these parentheses, and then we have our curly braces for our logic. So in our example here, if we just want to console.log add, cool, and you'll see we'll save, nothing happens. Well, we have to actually invoke the function like so by just calling it by its name, curly braces, or excuse me, parentheses, and you'll see here we actually print out add. Very nice. And we can do this time and time and time again. So you'll see we actually get add to print out 4 times. This is the power of a function, is that we have the same item being able to work with multiple, be able to be used multiple times. Now this isn't a very impressive function, so let's actually add some logic to it. So this return word here, say we wanted to return a value, return in a function will allow us to do that. So let's return 5. And you'll see nothing prints out, but we can go ahead and console.log. If we wrap these adds in a console.log, we'll actually print out the value that's being returned, which is in our case 5. And you'll see we get the 5 like so. So now we're returning a value. So this return keyword will return a string, return a number, return a Boolean, whatever it is that you need, will return it within the function. Now, that's still not very impressive. We're not adding anything. And based off our name here, our function name, you would think something would need to be added. So functions can take in what are called parameters. In our case, we're going to call this num1. And the way that, so this is our parameter. And what we're going to pass into the actual function call is an argument. It's basically the value for num1. So we're going to let's pass in 10 here. So in our case, we're going to still print out 5 because we're not using num1, but let's say we return num1, we're now going to get 10. And if we did the same thing here, we can now put 15, we can now put 20, and we'd get it to return 10, 15, and 20. Still not that impressive, but you can add multiple parameters. In our case here, num2, where now we want to add these two numbers together. So what is num1 plus num2? So if we put 10, and then we add 6, and we take 15, and we add 7, and we take 20, and we add 2, what are we going to get? We are now getting 16, 22, and 22, which is now we have a function add that will add two numbers anytime we need, and we've created this reusable code. So when we're solving problems, typically you're going to write it in a function so that you can reuse it and call it and not have to duplicate your code. That's really the point of functions and how you use them. All right, first and foremost, congratulations on finishing the course. It is an amazing thing taking on the task of learning a new concept, learning a new programming language, and I commend you for that. Now, might I ask on my behalf, as well as Increment.com, to go ahead and share the course if you enjoyed it. I think it covers a lot of great introductory topics to JavaScript and can be a great benefit. Now, where do we go from here? Because in learning, it's all about practicing and retaining that information, right? It may all make sense at this exact moment, but we want to make sure that it makes sense for the rest of your life. And to do that, you need to start practicing with it. There is a wonderful playlist on Scrimba.com called JS Algorithms. It'll give you the opportunity to take some of these methods to dive a little bit deeper with these data types and understand them and actually use what we discussed in here. So I encourage you to check that out. And you can just go and search for JS Algorithms on Scrimba.com. Thank you so much for watching the course and being a part of it. I hope you learned a lot, and I wish you the best of luck in your JavaScript endeavors.